The silence after I spoke was deafening. I just told Chloe's parents, and by extension, Chloe herself, that I wouldn't go into debt for our wedding. The words felt like a gut punch, both to them and to me, because in that moment, sitting at their pristine dining table, I knew it was over. But how did we even get here? How did the woman who once swore she loved my simple life become someone who needed me to borrow thousands just to prove my love? Looking back, the warning signs were there from day one. I just kept pushing them away. I grew up in Elmwood Creek, a place where people didn't flash their money around. Your word meant something. Nobody thought twice about driving a 10-year-old truck if it still ran fine. My parents taught me to save, to live within my means, never to go into debt for things I didn't absolutely need. I worked in IT, made good money, had a solid chunk saved. And honestly, I was content. I owned my small house outright, no car payments, no credit card debt. Nothing hanging over my head. Some people might call it boring, but I called it freedom. Then, one summer evening, my friend Noah threw a party. That's where I met Chloe. She walked in wearing this gorgeous dress, all confidence and style, completely out of place in Noah's backyard where everyone else was in jeans and t-shirts. She was from Metropolis, worked in marketing, and had this energy that just pulled you in. We got talking, and she told me she was tired of the rat race, exhausted from keeping up with expectations. She actually said my calm, grounded approach to life was refreshing. Like I was some kind of cold drink on a hot day. We started dating, and for the first few months, everything felt perfect. She'd drive out to visit me on weekends. We'd have coffee on my porch in the mornings, go fishing at the lake, cook dinner together. Just enjoy the quiet. She laughed at herself when she couldn't bait a hook. Said she loved how different my world was, kept telling me how lucky she felt to have found someone not obsessed with status. I remember one night, sitting under the stars, she looked at me with these soft eyes and said she finally felt like she could breathe. That was the moment I fell completely for her. The moment I thought I'd found someone who truly got me. But then, little things started happening. Small comments I brushed off. She'd joke about my truck being older than some of her friends' kids. Or remark about upgrading to a nicer restaurant instead of our local diner. Mention how her friends back in Metropolis had these amazing apartments with skyline views. At first, I thought she was just making harmless conversation. But the frequency started increasing. She'd scroll through social media, showing me engagement rings her friends got, huge diamonds that cost more than my truck. She'd laugh and say, "Can you imagine spending that much on a ring?" But there was always this flicker of want in her eyes that I tried to ignore. She started talking about her old life more often, the fancy dinners, weekend getaways, designer clothes. She'd always follow it up with, "But I don't miss any of that." Which, looking back, should have been my first real clue that maybe she did miss it. More than she wanted to admit. About 8 months in, I decided I wanted to marry her. I'd been saving my whole adult life, and I had enough to buy a beautiful sapphire engagement ring, her favorite gemstone, set in white gold with small accent stones. It wasn't a massive diamond, but it was elegant, unique, and I thought it represented us perfectly. I proposed to her on that same porch where we'd spent so many quiet mornings. At sunrise, coffee getting cold beside us. She said yes. Cried happy tears. For that first week, everything felt like a dream. Then came the moment that should have made me pause. We drove to her parents' house the following weekend so I could officially ask for their blessing. The whole drive, she seemed nervous, fidgeting, barely talking. Her mom opened the door with this huge smile, pulled Chloe into a hug, and immediately grabbed her hand to see the ring. I watched her mom's face change in real time. The smile faltered. Her eyes flicked to mine with a look I couldn't quite read. Her dad was more subtle, a firm handshake, "Congratulations." But I could feel the judgment. Her mom made some comment about sapphires being interesting choices with way too much enthusiasm, that tone people use when they're trying too hard to be polite about something they don't actually like. Chloe barely showed the ring to anyone else that day, kept her hand in her lap during dinner, didn't post any photos. The drive home was quiet. Uncomfortably quiet. When I asked if she was okay, she just smiled and said she was tired. But I saw the way she looked at that ring when she thought I wasn't watching, twisting it around her finger like she was trying to imagine it being something else. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling. I let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for weeks. That was the first time I wondered if she was embarrassed of what I gave her. If maybe the woman who said she loved my simple life was actually just waiting for me to become someone different. Someone who could give her the life she'd left behind. Here's what I should have recognized: when someone tells you they've left a lifestyle, watch how they talk about it. Chloe never said she disagreed with materialism or that she'd learned it was empty. She just said she was tired. That's not the same as changed. Tired means you want a break, not that you've fundamentally shifted your values. And when her mom made that comment about the ring, it wasn't about the sapphire. It was about me not meeting their financial expectations. I was being evaluated like a business investment, and I'd already failed the first assessment. The question I should have asked myself then was, if she's embarrassed to show her family what I gave her, how will she feel showing her friends, her coworkers, the rest of her world? But I didn't ask that question. I was in love. And love has a way of making you ignore the obvious until it's too late. The wedding planning started. I was thinking maybe 50 people, close family and friends. Something intimate. She pulled out her laptop, started typing names. I watched that list grow from 50 to 75 to 100. And she just kept going. When I asked why we needed so many people, she looked at me like I'd asked why we needed oxygen. Said it would be rude not to invite her entire extended family, all her work colleagues, college friends, everyone from her parents' social circle. I did the math. Over 200 guests. My intimate celebration turned into something that felt more like a corporate event. She started talking about venues. Vineyards, historic mansions, waterfront properties that required year-long waiting lists. Every option came with a price tag that made my stomach turn. Whenever I brought up the cost, she'd wave it off, say we'd figure it out. Weddings are expensive for everyone, she'd insist, this is normal. I suggested something simpler. The community center where Noah's sister had her wedding, or an outdoor ceremony at the lake. Chloe's face would cloud over, a tight smile telling me I'd said the wrong thing. She started using phrases like our special day and once in a lifetime whenever I questioned a cost, like those magic words justified any amount of spending. The catering became our first real fight. I found a great local caterer, buffet style, good food, reasonable prices. Chloe looked at the proposal for maybe 30 seconds before pulling up websites for premium companies, plated meals, multiple courses, wine pairings. The difference was staggering. Tripling our food budget. But she insisted buffets looked cheap and tacky. Her family would judge us. We couldn't ask people to stand in line at our own wedding. I tried to explain that most guests wouldn't care, they'd just be happy to celebrate. But she'd already moved on, talking about hiring a live band instead of a DJ. Every conversation about the wedding turned into a negotiation where I was unreasonable for wanting a budget, and she was just trying to make sure we didn't embarrass ourselves. I started dreading those planning sessions. This knot would form in my chest every time she said we needed to talk about wedding stuff, because I knew it meant another conversation about spending money we didn't have on things that didn't matter to me. Then one night, I couldn't sleep. I grabbed her laptop to check my email. The browser was still open to her last search. I saw the tabs. She'd been Googling how to upgrade an engagement ring, looking at diamond replacements, scrolling through before and after photos of rings with bigger center stones. I just sat there in the dark, staring at that screen, feeling something break inside my chest. She'd never said a word to me about being unhappy with the ring. But here was the evidence. She'd been thinking about it, probably since the day I proposed. I closed the laptop, lay back down. I couldn't stop thinking about all the times she'd angled her hand away in photos, kept it in her pocket during family gatherings. All the little signs I had missed. Or chosen to ignore. That was the moment I realized she'd never really been happy with what I offered. She'd just been waiting for me to figure out I needed to offer more. The bridesmaid situation pushed things even further. Chloe wanted her sister, Grace, and 3 college friends. Fine. Until she announced they'd all need to buy matching dresses from a specific boutique. These weren't regular dresses you could wear again. Custom-ordered gowns, several $100s each, plus alterations, plus the shoes she picked. Grace called me one afternoon, her voice tight with stress. She was having trouble affording everything. 2 kids, a mortgage, a tight budget. She tried talking to Chloe about more affordable options, but Chloe shut her down completely. Called her unsupportive. Grace said she was hoping maybe I could get through to Chloe, that Chloe would listen to her future husband even if she wouldn't listen to her own sister. When I brought it up that evening, Chloe's response made my blood run cold. She said if people couldn't afford to be in her wedding, maybe they weren't the right people to have standing beside her. Said real friends would find a way to make it work. This was her one chance to have everything perfect, and she wasn't going to compromise because other people had financial problems. I stared at the woman across from me, and I genuinely didn't recognize her anymore. This wasn't the person who'd sat on my porch, talking about how exhausting it was to keep up with expectations. This was someone creating those exact same expectations for everyone around her. The breaking point came with her bachelorette party. Her friends wanted a weekend in Scottsdale, clubs, beaches, bottle service. They expected all the bridesmaids to chip in for Chloe's expenses, on top of their own. Flights, hotels, party packages, easily over $1,000 each. Grace called me again, practically in tears, saying she couldn't afford it. But Chloe was making her feel guilty, posting in the group chat about sisterhood and how she was hurt that not everyone was excited. I finally sat Chloe down and told her we needed to have a serious conversation about money. About expectations. About what we could actually afford versus what she wanted. That's when she brought up the loan. She'd already researched it, looked into wedding loans, calculated how much we could borrow based on my income. She presented it like it was the obvious solution. Everyone takes out loans for their weddings, she said. We'll pay it back over time, the monthly payments won't be that bad if we just adjust our lifestyle a little bit. I felt like the walls were closing in, backed into a corner. I told her no. I wouldn't start our marriage buried in debt for one day. I wouldn't sacrifice our future for a party. That's when she called me cheap. Said I was selfish and small-minded. Asked if I even loved her. Because if I did, I'd want to give her the wedding she deserved. She said I was embarrassing her in front of her family. That everyone could see I wasn't willing to provide for her. Maybe she'd made a mistake, thinking I was the kind of man who could make her happy. Those words hung in the air between us. I realized this wasn't about a wedding anymore. This was about who we fundamentally were as people. And we were not the same. Let me break down what was really happening there, because this is where the manipulation reached its peak. Chloe had spent months slowly escalating her demands, testing my boundaries, seeing how far she could push. Every time I agreed to something bigger or more expensive, it reset her baseline. The guest list grew because I didn't fight hard enough when it hit 100. The venue got more elaborate because I'd already compromised on the catering. The bridesmaid dresses became non-negotiable because I'd let everything else slide. This is how financial abuse works in relationships. It's not one big demand. It's 1,000 small concessions that add up to you losing yourself completely. And that accusation that I didn't love her enough? That's the nuclear option of emotional manipulation. She was weaponizing my feelings, trying to make me prove my love by destroying my financial stability. The cruelest part was that she'd specifically sought out someone with my values, someone stable and debt-free, because that made me a good provider. But now, those same values were being reframed as character flaws. When love becomes conditional on spending, it was never really love. A few days later, she told me her parents wanted to have us over for dinner. Just a casual family meal, she said. But I knew better. I felt it in my gut that this wasn't going to be casual anything. I showed up to that dinner knowing exactly what was coming. But nothing truly prepares you for sitting at a table while 3 people tag team you about your financial decisions. Chloe's dad started it off smooth, talking about how weddings were investments in your future, how the connections you made and the impression you left could open doors. How successful people understood you sometimes had to spend money to show people you were worth knowing. Her mom jumped in with stories about weddings she'd attended, how the modest ones were always remembered as the sad ones. How nobody forgot a beautiful celebration, but everyone forgot a cheap one. Chloe sat there quiet, letting them do the work, occasionally nodding like they were making excellent points she'd never thought of before. They had charts. Actual printed charts showing average wedding costs in our region, payment plans for loans, even contact information for a loan officer her dad apparently played golf with. I felt like I was in a business presentation about my own life, except the product they were selling was debt and disappointment. Her dad looked me straight in the eye and said I needed to think about what kind of man I wanted to be. Whether I was the kind who stepped up for his family or the kind who let them down when it mattered. That's when something shifted inside me. When I realized this wasn't about love or commitment or building a life together. This was about control, and keeping up appearances, and funding a fantasy that had nothing to do with me. I set down my fork, looked at Chloe, and waited for her to say something. To defend me. To tell her parents that we'd figure this out together as a couple. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Just kept staring at her plate like the pattern on the china was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. So, I said it. Said the thing I'd been holding back for weeks because I kept hoping we'd find our way back to those quiet mornings on the porch. I told them I wouldn't sacrifice my future for one day. That I'd worked too hard to build a stable life to throw it away on a party. That if Chloe needed me to go into debt to prove I loved her, then maybe we wanted different things out of this marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence where you can hear people's brains recalculating everything they thought they knew. Chloe's face went red, then white, and she finally looked at me with eyes full of anger instead of love. Her dad started to say something about me being unreasonable, but I was already standing up, already thanking them for dinner, already walking toward the door. Chloe followed me outside. We stood in her parents' driveway under the porch light while moths circled above us. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I told her I was pretty sure marrying someone who valued a wedding more than a marriage was the bigger mistake. And then I got in my truck and drove away. The next few weeks were brutal in ways I didn't expect. Chloe told everyone who would listen that I was cheap and controlling. That I'd promised her a beautiful wedding and then backed out. That she'd wasted 2 years of her life on someone who didn't value her. Her version of events spread through her social circle like wildfire. Suddenly, I was getting messages from people I barely knew, telling me what a terrible person I was. Noah told me to ignore it. Said anyone who actually knew me would see through it. But it still stunned to have my name dragged through the mud by someone who'd told me she loved me just weeks before. I threw myself into work, started going to the gym more, spent time with friends who didn't ask me every 5 minutes if I was okay. Then, about a month after our breakup, I heard through Grace that Chloe had started dating someone new, a lawyer named Julian. Apparently, he had money and wasn't afraid to spend it. Part of me felt relieved that she'd moved on so quickly. Maybe now the drama would finally die down and I could start rebuilding my life in peace. But Chloe being Chloe, moving on quietly wasn't really her style. She posted photos constantly, designer bags, fancy restaurants, weekend trips to Cancun. Always with captions about finally being treated the way she deserved. Julian seemed nice enough from what I could see. Always smiling in photos. Always dressed sharp. The kind of guy who looked like he walked out of a cologne advertisement. I stopped checking her social media after a while. It felt like watching a performance that had nothing to do with real life. But I'd still hear updates from mutual friends who couldn't help themselves from filling me in. Apparently, Chloe was already talking about wedding plans again, already looking at venues, showing off a new engagement ring that made her sapphire look like a toy from a vending machine. Friends told me she was pushing Julian even harder than she'd pushed me. Every conversation was about the wedding, about what she wanted, about making sure everything was absolutely perfect this time. I almost felt bad for the guy. Almost wanted to warn him. But I figured he was a lawyer and probably smart enough to figure it out on his own. Then one Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after I'd walked away from Chloe, I ran into Megan at the grocery store. She'd been one of Chloe's bridesmaids, and we'd always gotten along fine. She looked genuinely happy to see me, which was surprising given how Chloe had been talking about me. She suggested we grab coffee. We sat down at a cafe, and she told me she'd felt terrible about how everything went down, that she'd never really believed Chloe's version of events. Honestly, she just needed to vent to someone who'd understand what Chloe was really like. Megan told me everything. Things I never would have known otherwise. Chloe had pushed Julian to book the most expensive venue in the entire region. Insisted on a guest list even bigger than the one she'd wanted with me. Demanded a ring upgrade just months after he proposed because the first one wasn't quite right. The bridesmaids were all stressed about costs again. Chloe had picked even more expensive dresses this time, and the bachelorette party was now planned for Cancun instead of Scottsdale. But here's the thing that made my coffee taste better than it had any right to. Julian had started asking questions. Started pushing back. Started realizing that maybe this wedding wasn't about building a life together, but about putting on a show. 2 weeks before they were supposed to send out invitations, he called the whole thing off. Told Chloe he couldn't marry someone who cared more about the wedding than the marriage. Ended their relationship entirely. Megan said Chloe was devastated. Not because she'd lost Julian, but because she'd lost the wedding. Lost the chance to prove to everyone that she could have the perfect day she'd always wanted. I wish I could say I felt nothing when I heard that. That I was completely over it and didn't care what happened to her anymore. But the truth is, I felt vindicated. Felt like the universe had confirmed what I'd known all along, that I'd made the right choice walking away when I did. A few months later, I made a decision I'd been thinking about for a while. I sold my small house and put a down payment on a bigger place. A real house, with land and a view and room to grow. The kind of property I'd always dreamed about but never bought because I was saving for a future that turned out to be an illusion. I started dating again eventually. Nothing serious at first. Just coffee and conversations with people who didn't measure my worth by my willingness to go into debt. Life got quieter. Simpler. Better in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or proving anything to anyone. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that moment on her parents' driveway, about walking away from someone I thought I'd spend my life with. And I'd feel grateful instead of sad. Here's what I learned, and I hope it helps someone else. Love shouldn't come with a price tag. And the person who truly wants to build a life with you will care more about the life you're building than the party you throw to announce it. When someone shows you who they really are, especially when it comes to money and values, believe them the first time. Those little comments Chloe made about my truck, my house, wanting better restaurants, those weren't jokes. Those were her real feelings leaking out before she'd perfected the act. And when someone uses love as leverage to get what they want, when they tell you that proving your love requires you to damage yourself financially or emotionally, that's not love at all. That's control wearing a romantic disguise. I didn't lose a fiancé that night in her parents' driveway. I escaped a future I would have regretted forever. I escaped years of debt, years of feeling like I was never enough. Years of watching my hard-earned savings disappear into someone else's fantasy while my own dreams collected dust. The wedding she wanted would have lasted one day, but the debt would have lasted years, and the resentment would have lasted even longer. Sometimes the best decision you can make is the one that disappoints everyone else but saves yourself. What's the biggest financial mistake you've ever almost made for someone else?